Starting in July, fully vaccinated Canadians and permanent residents flying into Canada will no longer have to quarantine at a hotel. These travelers will still receive a COVID-19 test upon arrival and still have to have an isolation plan. But once they receive a negative result, and that could be in 1, 2, or 3 days, then their mandatory isolation period is done. And while this is a step towards the easing of border restrictions, it doesn't go as far as a recommendation by an expert panel commissioned by the federal government. That panel recommended an outright end to the hotel quarantine policy. I asked Minister Hajdu about that earlier on the program.
Every layer of protection that we've added at the border has allowed to ensure that we are doing everything we can to detect travelers who are positive for COVID-19. And the government authorized hotels played an important role and still do in ensuring that people have a safe place to isolate while they wait for their day one test.
Primetime panel is here to dig into this story. Dr. Edward-Ooi Poon is our guest. He is the founder of Faces of Advocacy, a group dedicated to helping reunify families separated by Canada's border restrictions. He is in Dublin, Ireland. And Piya Chattopadhyay is the host of CBC Radio's The Sunday Magazine. She is in a very colorful background, Toronto. And Brian Gallant, former Premier of New Brunswick, now the CEO of the Canadian Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation, joining us from beautiful downtown Shediac Bridge, New Brunswick. I'll assume that the downtown and where you are is also all one and the same. Dr. Poon, you have worked for months, advocated for months to help families reunify, families separated by the border restrictions. Your reaction to today's announcement?
Please call me David. This is the first step, hopefully, to a number of other steps on a path to family reunification. There are a number of good things in today's announcements. A lot of it was unclear during the press conference, but there is a substantial amount that we can be thankful for to reunify families. The challenge is there are a number of pieces that have kept a lot of families apart. And that's why I think we need to actually continue to move forward and advocate in order to bring those families together. For example, one of the basic ideas, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you what are the concerns, so fire away, yeah.
Well, the main thing is that a fully vaccinated Canadian can come back without hotel quarantine, but how many of the Canadians are actually fully vaccinated? We've had a substantial issue with getting the second dose. Yeah. It's also not consistent with all the recommendations that you mentioned with the Priority Strategies panel last week. And in addition to that, the discussion on how this would affect the land border with the United States wasn't really gone into. And then finally, there's a risk of it not being operationalized very well. And so while there are many good intentions, will it actually work?
And let me just ask you, I mean, I say that you've done work trying to get families to be reunited, and we're not just talking about people who want to go off on vacation. I mean, there's some people have simply done that, have flown off to Florida or Europe or wherever, and then come back, and then the hotel quarantine was put in place. Some people have paid fines to get out of that or flown to the US and walked or driven across the border instead. You're talking about people who have been separated, and tell me about some, just give me a snippet of a story.
So to clarify what happened today, because it was a little bit difficult during the press conference, immediate family and extended family are also allowed to enter Canada with the proper vaccination. If they're fully vaccinated, they can test out of hotel quarantine. So why do we want to do that? Well, you might hear a lot of people, oh, I want to go to Canada, go party in Banff. But really what you have are people who want to come together so a miscarriage isn't had alone, so a dying mother gets to see her children one last time, for families to be together. If you ask yourself, where and who do you want to be with during a worldwide pandemic? Most of the time, you'll say your family. Binational Canadian families exist, they're valid, and they just want to be together. We're not here to go partying in Miami.
Brian, let me pull you into the conversation here. And it is a very cautious approach that's being taken by the federal government. We don't even really have clear metrics on what it will take to go to certain phases. There's a lot of detail that's still to be filled in. Why do you think there is such caution?
I would say a few things. First off, the idea that they would open things up and somehow something would go wrong, and the people that would be upset with it going wrong would point to that policy would definitely put a lot of fear in the public policy decision makers. So I think that's in the back of their minds, there's no question, and that would lead people to be a little more cautious. The second thing is, obviously, if there is an election in the next few months, as many people have opined that there will be, then you would even maybe more want to be a little on the cautious side when it comes to these decisions for the very same reason. If it somehow goes a bit wrong, if because you've been a little more slack and eased off on restrictions, that causes some issues and some spreading, and all of a sudden people are pointing to that policy being the challenge or the start of that challenge. Well, that certainly isn't a good scene if you want to get into an election, say early fall. The other thing I think is the message or implicit message coming from this policy. People are pretty encouraged, I guess, by the federal government's way in which they would ease the restrictions to get their doses, get their first and second dose. So whether that's intended or not, I would think it would be. They're trying to also say, look, if you want to be able to do some of these things, we really need you to get vaccinated. We really need you to get your first and second dose. And that's how we're going to be able to sort of open up and get things to some version of normal. So I really think those are the reasons. Didn't come as much of a surprise for me, because I think that's why they're going to be erring on the side of caution.
Mm-hmm. Piya, I want to talk to you sort of about timing and optics. The Prime Minister about to leave this week abroad to the G7, plans to stay in a hotel as required when he comes back. What do you think the certainty of that trip, we knew when it was going to happen on the calendar, but what do you think that trip might have done to the optics of when you make an announcement like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that played into this. The federal government's own panel made the advice to get rid of these hotel quarantines in May. And here we are on, a couple of days before the G7 starts, and our Prime Minister and many others with him in terms of entourage and media are also going. Now, he is going to, upon his return, stay in a hotel, but it's not one of these quarantine hotels, and that includes his entourage and the media. They'll be isolating in a different hotel, and the Conservatives have said, look, you're asking for special treatment. So that's sort of the politics of this. But in terms of optics and perception and leaders modeling good behavior, so those who are being led, i.e. Canadians, can see that in a leader. I think if Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, came back and said, forget it, I ain't going to any hotel, that would cost them perception-wise, but also politically as well. So I think there's a lot in this about timing, as there usually is in politics.
David, I want to wrap up with you. What are the things that you would like to see in the near future to help with family reunification? Step one, perhaps today. What does step 2, 3, 4, 5 look like?
Step one is based on a principle the government has been saying for months. We will follow the science. Last week, they were given a whole pile of recommendations by scientists they trust. They did not follow all the science. I'm very grateful to the ministries who actually put together these exemptions for us and are trying to operationalize it. But the fact is, the government has a very clear roadmap from scientists that they trust, that they should follow. There should be a plan for partially vaccinated. There should be a plan for those who cannot get vaccinated. And this was not discussed at all today. This is step one. Step two is dealing with everything else in that priority strategies panel, the recommendations that the government themselves commissioned.
Okay, thanks very much to the three of you. We will say goodbye here to Dr. David Poon from the Faces for Advocacy. Thank you very much for contributing to this part. And Piya and Brian, we will continue our discussion in just a moment.